Welcome back to another meeting of the Gadamer Reading Group. And this month is an interesting one, right? It's a late text, 1984, called "The Problem of Dilthey Between Romanticism and Positivism." And as I was reading this, I was really missing Rudy McCreel, who's an old friend of the society, who knew his Dilthey chapter and verse in and out, every text from beginning to end. And I wish I had him next to me the whole
Mhm.
time, helping me sort of understand because so many of Gadamer's references are sort of elusive, right? He sort of says something, and I thought, boy, I wish I knew the backstory here, so I knew exactly. Rudy, tell me exactly what he's referring to here, and you could say, yeah, in 1894, he has this where he says this, and no, I missed that. I missed that context. I don't know the Dilthey writings as experts, or as well as probably Gadamer's audience did. So I'm hoping we all can work through this together and see what there is to learn from Gadamer. So as tradition in the beginning, if there's something that somebody wants to bring up that they are so excited to talk about, it would be hard to wait. Jump right in.
I could, if no one else wants to go, I can go.
Yeah, John, because you're one of the people who recommended this, requested this.
Yeah. By the way, I'm noticing that there are four Johns today.
I see it.
Uh, yeah. So I want to get to the last part on page 87. There's a couple of key passages there, but I did want to put it in the context of something that he says earlier, if I could.
Hmm.
Uh, okay.
Sure.
So you sort of know where he's heading, where on page 80 he makes a reference to Heidegger, and he talks about Heidegger's destruction of the concepts of consciousness and subjectivity, right? And I mean, I think that's ultimately going to be the thing that he has to really wrestle with Dilthey, because Dilthey is so grounded in this idea of the immediate human experience of the individual in life, right? Which is, and this sort of this what he calls an inwarded experience, which is so tied to the individual person in the immediacy of their life, right? Their Leibniz. Um, and so that's what he says Dilthey has to struggle with this as well, but his clue about where he's going with this is to cite Heidegger's destruction of subjectivity, right? So he's kind of throwing down the gauntlet there a little bit in advance. And then and, uh, and so because for Gadamer, the way Gadamer understands Dilthey is that Dilthey has this dream, right, of founding a sort of the Geisteswissenschaften on this sort of a kind of what he calls a meaning fulfillment, uh, uh, across time, a sort of atemporal ideal, right, of truth, right? Um, and then so Gadamer starts to comment on the problem with that sort of what he regards as an idealism. He calls it an atemporal ideal point. So on 81, he says, it is as if, okay, so this is a sentence on page um, 81. It's the last sentence of the second full paragraph that begins the attempt to avoid relativism. And the sentence is, it is as if darkness and light were not truly interwoven, even during the course of one's life, so that things in a changing light are illuminated in a changing manner and often fall completely into obscurity. So that's Gadamer sort of speaking in his sort of a Heideggerian vein, and he gets even more sort of skeptical, right, of this meaning fulfillment on page 83, when he has a list of things. So this is the first full paragraph, the goal paragraph, but at the end of that paragraph, he has a list of things. and he's referring to something else at that point, but this is sort of the Heideggerian view, something hidden, misjudged, forgotten, repressed, the things that are not immediately apparent and transparent to us, right?
Mhm.
Um, so there's so there's a part of this that's clear to me and a part of this that's not clear to me that I wanted to ask everyone about. The part that's pretty straightforward and clear is that Gadamer, to the extent that Dilthey um, is invested in any kind of enlightenment theory of transparency uh, and sort of full knowledge, and the sort of his sort of hankering after the dream of a science, right? That's clearly not anything that Gadamer wants to have anything to do with. But he struggles with Dilthey in a very respectful way, because I think Dilthey is also mindful of those problems. And so that takes me to the section that's that's peculiar for me, which is on page 87, right? The bottom parts of 87. Um, and you'll see that, for example, in the paragraph, the center paragraph that begins, "One must remember," towards the end of that paragraph, he says, now this is Dilthey sort of after he had encountered Husserl's challenge and adopted to it, started adopting towards the end, and Gadamer is very um, appreciative of the movement towards a more hermeneutic perspective that Dilthey was making as a result of this challenge. And so he says, that Dilthey, he leaves aside the sort of the absolute grounding in the Erlebnis, and moves on to something more like expression as the sort of the foundation. So, but he says, thus Dilthey, in his own peculiar way, appropriated the idea of meaning fulfillment
Mhm.
as the fullness of meaning that gradually enriches itself from inner experiences, a fullness that accrues to experience. So that sounds a little bit more sort of historicized to me, but it still sounds very much like Dilthey, right? Um, Inner experience, fullness, meaning fulfillment, and so forth. Um, so I'm not sure how much progress he's making towards a hermeneutic sort of perspective. And then in the very last paragraph on that page, where he's talking about the links between Husserl's intentionality and Dilthey's notion of expression, with the triad lived experience, expression, meaning, he, Dilthey, manages to overcome the ambiguity of the immediacy of lived experience. Um, he secures a positive sense for the ambiguity of meaning as it stood between, and there's that key sort of hermeneutic word, between the one ideal meaning and the self-constituting meaningfulness, and the self-constituting meaningfulness, period. I guess it's period, right? So I kind of feel in those last pages, I'm he seems to be hovering between, uh, I mean, he's trying to agree with Dilthey as much as he can, or to draw as much from him in a hermeneutic way as he can. And I don't quite understand um, how what Gadamer thinks, what Gadamer is approving of in terms of the fullness of meaning that gradually enriches itself from inner experiences, a fullness that accrues to experience. To what extent is that part of the hermeneutics, right? A Gadamerian philosophical hermeneutics, that fullness. It's clearly no longer the fullness of the immediate present of the sciences. It's something more in between. So that's my question. How far is this pointing us in the direction of how far does Gadamer reconcile himself with Dilthey?
Wow. So there's both specific questions about what's going on in the text at these points. What is Gadamer saying about Dilthey and then to what extent is Gadamer agreeing or disagreeing with Dilthey? And then the bigger question, maybe throughout this, is where is Gadamer aligning himself with Dilthey, and where is he just simply explaining Dilthey? I think that's a question we can ask of many of Gadamer's discussions of other people, whether he's talking about Plato or Hegel or Dilthey. It's like, which are the Gadamer points? Um, so maybe of those two places, either the one on 81 or the one on 87, do we want to start with one of those two? Look at them carefully, see what's going on.
Before we do that, I wanted to ask John Arthos if it would be helpful to clarify Gadamer, Gadamer and Dilthey's positions relative to Husserl to see where they are adjacent to one another and where they are different from one another. Would Husserl add that kind of contrast to clarify that, or would it be more difficult to do that?
That's going to make it more difficult, Eric, because and Gadamer goes into much greater depth about that complex interrelationship in other places. But I actually do think that would make it more complicated because Gadamer has his own issues with Husserl's, what he calls at some times idealism, right? And so it just triangulates and it makes it even more complicated, I think.
I think we can say this though, that Gadamer is more sympathetic to Husserl's account of intentionality, so that when he says Dilthey doesn't go this route in order to explain why it is their Leibniz is not simply some private internal experience, but actually has something more objective in it. He doesn't use intentionality to explain that. He looks elsewhere. I think we can say that Husserl's main concern about Dilthey and all of the Weltanschauung theories is that they didn't really get at a kind of grounding foundation. They maybe articulated the character of a times, of a period, but they didn't really get at something deeper and more foundational. And so Husserl sort of thought they may have been just relativist in the end. John, did you want to say
Yeah,
something about that?
I just want to add one thing. I mean, the crucial sort of problem for Gadamer with regard to both Dilthey and Husserl, I think, is that the notion of continuity that Dilthey has is the continuity that exists in the coherence of a life, of one life, of my life, right?
Mhm.
And Dilthey tries to make the leap towards, generations and histories. And Gadamer thinks that he's not very successful in doing that. He has this theory of the types of the seven types of Weltanschauungen, right? Uh, and he finds it very unsatisfactory. And similarly with Husserl. But for Gadamer, the big problem, and this is, I went back and started to read the section on Dilthey's entanglements in Truth and Method. The big problem is that Dilthey doesn't give us a way to find coherence across history once you've abandoned the immediate experience of the person. That's the issue that Gadamer sees at the heart of Dilthey's own problematic.
Yeah. Gadamer will see Dilthey as an advance over Husserl to the extent he thinks of reason as historical, takes historicity seriously. Is that fair? Yeah, you get that in that section. Okay, so 81 or 87, where would you like to start?
I would just add to
Yeah,
John
John.
Arthos's comment. The Gadamer sees what Dilthey was attempting to do actually impossible, and we're still struggling with it today in our attempting to reconcile hermeneutics with realism. We haven't moved beyond Dilthey in this sense, and so I think that he says this early on, like the premise early on, like where he almost says like what Dilthey took on, precluded him from um, oh yeah, at the bottom of page 77, and the fragmentary, the incomplete, the protean malleability that distinguishes Dilthey's own work is preordained, as it were,
Mhm.
by the object of investigation. Um, so he was beat before he started, just like uh, Dilthey says that the Greeks were beat before they started trying to do what they did. But I mean, it's ironic. But I think that's, of course, and I would say this that like this allusion to depth psychology is is you don't need Heidegger to tell you that there's no, the cogito, there's no sort of apodictic knowledge of the self to, this subjectivism of Descartes to tell you that that's a myth, that just doesn't work. So I would just add that to complicate things.
Sure. My suggestion is we go back to the last paragraph on page 79 and work our way through 81. The paragraph begins, one can see a problem emerge here that was the lead Dilthey eventually from the immediacy of being inner of the hermeneutic to the hermeneutic turn of his thought. Is that all right? That will help to clarify too what he means by a lived experience in Erlebnis.
And at the same time, I agree that Gadamer did learn from Husserl and did gain from Husserl.
Mhm.
I just wanted to it's not like Husserl or Dilthey. It's not Dilthey good, Dilthey bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you learn from both of them.
But I
Oh,
mean,
yeah,
if
go
I
ahead, Antoine.
jump in on this Dilthey good, Dilthey bad, I mean, of course not. But in Truth and Method, a lot of Gadamer's fight. I mean, a lot of Gadamer's project is fighting against the notion of Erlebnis. From beginning to end, it seems really a huge problem for him.
Mhm.
Uh, a kind of hyper subjectivistic and um, unattainable position where we just can't have a dialogue. If your position is in Erlebnis,
Right.
what can we say? What can we do? And I do think that it's a huge problem. I think that Erlebnis is coming back in contemporary discourse in all sorts of ways. Um, Positions that are stated and cannot be discussed um, because they're felt in the inner core of one's life. And that's really bad, I think, for Gadamer, from a Gadamerian perspective, because it's the collapse of dialogue. It's an impossibility of dialogue. Anyway, I just wanted to say,
Yeah.
it seems like there's something truly bad with Dilthey's philosophy.
Or at least if we take serious or Leibniz, right? The only hope for connection through Leibniz is a certain sort of intuition, a certain sort of empathy, a certain sort of understanding where you just grasp the experience and maybe share in the experience. Is that fair? Where we can't put it into words and communicate it, but maybe through a work of art. I mean, this is what Dilthey actually says, right? Maybe through a work of art, through a piece of music, through something else, their Leibniz gets communicated and shared. And Gadamer that's not an answer that Gadamer will be sympathetic to, right? That's for him, that's part of the problem. But I wanted to sort of start to map out the picture of where we go. Did John Garner, do you have your hand up?
I did very, very briefly, and you pointed us to 79, and it seems like I don't want to shift the page, but it does seem to me that where you started us out there on 79 ends in that paragraph on 87, or culminates, maybe not ends, but culminates when in the middle of that paragraph on 87,
Hmm.
we looked at the end, but if we back up a little earlier, the sentence that stuck out to me was what Dilthey learned was this. This is what he learned from Husserl on page 87. What Dilthey learned was this: an expression can have a meaning without this having to be the expression for a lived experience, or excuse me, of a lived experience.
Right.
But that seems to me to be the big. He thinks that Dilthey recognizes this at some point, that it can't just be an expression of a singular life. But I think he's maybe I'm not sure how far Dilthey takes that, or maybe Dilthey doesn't take it far enough. Maybe I'm not sure.
Right. Is it intuitively, does that make sense? If
Yeah,
we have these lived experiences, we also can recognize them as pointing to something bigger than us.
yeah,
Aren't, they're my experience. I've got this personal character to it, and it speaks to me and sort of says something about life. But then I also recognize it's also a condition of my time and history and shared with other people. And is that sort of the idea, I think, isn't it?
yeah. I think so. Yeah, an expression can have a meaning without it being of just this singularity
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
inexpressible in some way. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I think that's the category of intuition in the logical investigations that's being referred to here. But again, I
Yeah.
agree that we haven't advanced beyond Dilthey today
Hmm.
at all. We're still struggling.
Right.
Until we understand Gadamer, we won't advance beyond Dilthey.
Yeah. So the idea that in an individual perception, something universal can be present.
Mhm.
Greg Lynch, would you like it in here? Greg, you may have to mute yourself.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to get the unmute button to work. Yeah, I was just gonna. I agree completely with what Antoine said there, and I think part of the problem with the Erlebnis picture of meaning is not simply the one you brought up, David, that it like seems to kind of cut us off from other people. But even if we did somehow succeed in like making that connection to the other person through empathy or whatever, what we encounter there still isn't a truth claim, right? It's still not something that tells us something about the world and that therefore we can debate and dialogue about. It's merely this kind of subjective experience. And even if I could discover like, oh, this is the experience David is having right now, it's all I could do is like, well, that's neat. Right. I appreciate that. There wouldn't be any truth claim to it. And I think that's the other side of the worry here is that Dilthey wants Dilthey misses the connection between meaning and truthfulness in a way that I think Gadamer wants to be, and that Husserl wants to be there too, which is why Husserl Gadamer thinks has a kind of salutary effect on Dilthey, even if Dilthey doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I was struck by Antoine's comment that he thinks that talk, a version of Erlebnis speak, is coming back in sort of popular culture. And so I was thinking of some of the ways in which we sort of see it through ideas of connection that involves sort of empathetic sharing and presence, right? Which seems to lack the talk about knowledge that you're talking about.
Yeah.
John Arthos.
Okay. I think I'm going to be sort of the Dilthey defender then here. Um, and and I think that Gadamer is too. I mean, Gadamer spends so much time puzzling over what Dilthey achieved for hermeneutics and so and his treatment is so nuanced, right? Um, so he has deeply respects him, and in fact, he says, at the end. Well, you saw what he said at the end about his how great an intellectual he was, but the thing is, I think you need both. I would say that you need both. So you clearly don't. You're as everyone was be saying, if you're left with the sort of the if you're trapped within your own inner world and unable to communicate or express or share, obviously that's unhealthy, right? But you can't do it the other way either. I mean, if we weren't sensing, feeling organisms, right, who experience the world in meaningful ways in which and this is the theme throughout, in Heidegger especially, there's no one who can experience my pain, right? Because I am this biological organism who feels, who lives my own particular life, right? And so, what so it's important not to oversimplify what Dilthey was doing with Erlebnis. Now, Erlebnis, the sort of the Erlebnis cult, it became this fashionable thing. It exists nowadays, as you all say, in awful ways. We've become the experience culture. They've been writing books on this, right? And it's anathema to me, right? But what Dilthey was trying to do was to explain how a person's life achieves coherence. Um, and Gadamer starts to talk almost in a sort of incipient narrative way when he starts to talk about that, the Zusammenhang of how these units of experience are connected to each other throughout the course of a life that builds the life of like a narrative identity, what Ricoeur would call a narrative identity, right?
Mhm.
And Gadamer approves of that. He just says that it's not helpful if you're going to try to if meaning is going to be passed down from generation to generation, right? So that's why it's important to me that he says between. It's between those two things. Um, so I really want to resist the temptation of of overgeneralizing about what Dilthey is saying about and especially given the fact that he really was constantly changing his views, right? Uh, and moving more and more, as the essay says, towards a hermeneutic perspective.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, John. Eric, did you have your hand up? Did you give up?
Yeah, it was related to this the kind of symbolic capital of the currency of lived experience, because I'm thinking about how it's gained traction in places like comm studies or religious studies,
Mhm.
where the rhetoric of lived experience has become a strategy by which like social historians try to position themselves as legitimate scholarship compared to like abstract theology or abstract speculation or just mere theories in the study of religion or theories of communication, that it doesn't get at the lived experience of actual ritual practices or things like this.
Mhm.
So to me, like lived experience becomes a more vacuous phrase for like positioning what is the actual subject matter of study, that it is how Dilthey and Gadamer's responding to Dilthey, that lived experience is capturing the personal significance of a sequence of events or something like that.
Sure.
That's all. It was just
Yeah. I should say that what always helps me when thinking about these things with Dilthey is thinking about Dewey, because Dewey was influenced by Dilthey, and Dewey talks about having an experience, which is sort of his translation of Erlebnis. Um, and so it's not just lived experience, like what is it like, but it's that there are these moments there are these periods in your life. I guess it could be like high school was an experience. There are these periods that have a certain character to them that we come to understand afterwards, that are, intellectual and emotional and practical, all woven together, and that shape us and give us our character and identity, that become markers for our lives, and that, as John Orthos talks about, sort of become the defining points of the narratives of our lives, whether they're good or, I mean, they could be bad, they could be traumatic. And so this is when Dilthey talked about having an experience or aliveness. I tend to think in terms of Dewey having an experience, something that speaks to us, that makes us feel alive, even if it's something bad, and then as opposed to experiences which are just going on all the time. So I think that when you talk about the way that historians, sociologists talk about lived experiences, they're talking more about the first person, what it's like to be in that situation, which is different than en Erlebnis, which is having an experience, right? A kind of thing where you can actually point to and has a clear time frame. And when he talks on 81, this idea that at the end of the Erlebnis, we only start to get the full picture of what it was that just happened, that we just went through, or with a work of art, we see it again and again. And in doing so, we with each repetition we see it anew, we reflect back on what we had before, and everything builds. So there is a sort of future trajectory to it. The future points to the ways in which the past has been incomplete. So there's
Yeah,
also in the idea of an experience, is the idea of a kind of place where we could take it all in. We never get there. We never have that. But
I,
there's that sort of sense, and that's what I feel like he was talking about on 81, the
I wonder
atemporal ideal end. Yeah,
I
yeah, go
wonder
ahead.
if Gadamer's objecting. Gadamer is saying this is what Dilthey is saying, but this is not the way you can grasp history. And six, we are all Dilthey. We are intuitively think like Dilthey does. We haven't got beyond that yet. That's I think we have to get. And this sort of he's saying you can't have the the concluding note define the whole thing of the symphony or the last time like historical reality. You can't grasp historical reality through this kind of a nexus. I mean, Dilthey was on the way there, and Gadamer uses this sense of a nexus in a sense, but he's he's not. I mean, it's very intuitive and natural for us because that's the way we think. We think like Dilthey thought,
Yeah, I
and
think on page 82 is the line where I think Gadamer just sort of puts it straightforwardly about why this is not how you do history. He says, on Dilthey's view, it means the eyewitness surpasses the historian, and the autobiography has greater testimonial value than the result of critical archival research. Right? So these first person moments that are really meaningful for the individual. He says, yeah, but that's not where you look to in order to do history. So that's what I think you're absolutely right when Gadamer is saying that's not how history works.
yeah,
That's interesting. It's making me think of tension that occurs in Holocaust studies where
Mm.
like a historian will give a presentation, but then a survivor in the audience will say, but I was there.
Hmm.
And
Yes.
somehow the I was there trumps the historian's critical investigation or archival research like this. I wanted to talk a little bit at the bottom of 81 when
Okay.
he's asking the question, like, what does it really mean to quote unquote understand a piece of music? I mean, he's still kind of criticizing Dilthey here, right? Like,
Hmm.
um, but that's where I wanted to ask more about the relationship between like experience in the Kantian sense of the field of possible experiences, lived experience as actual specific experiences that speak to me, right? And then significance is another way of talking about these experiences standing out, and then understanding is when we can put like what a semantic, like does Gadamer have a semantic kind of paradigm for what understanding really is, and that's why you can't understand music because it doesn't have discourse. I guess that's what I'm asking here.
Yeah, that's a core question. Does anyone like to take that up? Yeah, John Garner.
I don't know if I'll take that up, but it's a related question that keeps bugging me, which is that would Gadamer's response be in a way, and this might have been suggested earlier, would Gadamer's response in a way be that if it isn't discussable, if it can't be a basis for dialogue, it can't be true? I mean, is it that simple in a certain way? And that doesn't sound right to me, but if that's the critique, so that's I guess I'm not sure. I'm asking a question. Yeah.
Can I take a crack at that? Because it
Absolutely.
goes to the back to the statement, the sentence that you read, David.
Yeah.
So just remind us, this is on page 82. Um, this would mean that the eyewitness surpasses the historian, and that the autobiography has a greater testimonial value than the result of critical archival research. So, I mean, to me, it's manifestly true that Gadamer is right. What he's implying is right here, right? That the historian is going to have a broader view, and that autobiography cannot be the basis of I mean, it cannot be the single basis of history as the single criterion, right? That's straightforward enough. But the problem that I run into here is, and so John Garner, when you say that personal experience has no truth value, I mean, I would reject that utterly, just personally, right? And so I would say to that, would you rather be the person who is, living out the life experience, or the historian sitting in her office writing about it? I would take the first any day of the week. right? So I guess that's how I would respond to that.
Not sure.
Absolutely.
It-
Yeah.
Can I
Yeah.
get John
Go
Garner?
ahead.
Wait,
Oh,
John Garner, was
oh,
that
unless
what
it's
you
a
were saying? I'm not sure was that what you were saying? Was that the truth of the? But go ahead.
unless it were a terrible experience, I would prefer the historian seat if it were really awful. But yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you would agree with that. Okay. Antoine, did you going to get in here?
No, it's the same comment as John Garner just made.
Okay.
But I do think, I mean, I can go back in the position of defending the critique of Dilthey. It's just that it's not so much that your experience, your lived experience has no truth value, but it's that it's not making a truth claim in the world, so to speak. It might have taught you something, but if it's really the Erlebnis, then there's going to be an impossibility of like sharing that to others, such that it's meaningful to talk about it and to learn from that experience you had. I think that's what he's criticizing. So it's like, okay, super disclosive lived experience for me, but then it's pointless to try to explain it to you because it's never going to be properly explained. It's never going to, or I'm going to try to do it, but it's necessarily going to be insufficient or something like that. So that the core of what I experienced truthfully
Yeah.
is, yeah, it's stuck in me, so to speak. And I think that for Gadamer, this is an indication that it's not. It's not what Gadamer calls Wahrheitsanspruch, I think. But it's not to say that it's not disclosive about yourself or that you didn't have a great moment or a very terrible moment. I don't think he disputes that. It's just this is not the locus of hermeneutics. This is not the locus of hermeneutic understanding.
Okay, good. Yeah, Don Marshall.
Well, what I know about Dilthey would fit comfortably in a thimble. So, I don't have a lot to contribute here, but I'm surprised to hear at this, there's no dialogue as though lived experience locks you in your subjectivity. I find that odd. Isn't it Dilthey who insists on art
Yeah.
as the expression of lived experience, which we can grasp through the interpretation of a work of art? It leads us back to the lived experience, which is at its, and that's sort of Schleiermacher in his sort of psychological interpretation as opposed to grammatical interpretation. So it does seem to me he does think that we do share these lived experiences and we do grasp the lived experiences of others, but then the emphasis has to fall on the expression, which Gadamer points to later on. Anyway, just for what it's worth, it just seems so to me. I may be completely wrong.
No, I think that's right. There are ways to communicate it. You're not just communicating by putting it into words. You communicate through art, through poetry, through other creative human processes like that.
Can I just add that sharing is the sharing of a lived experience. It's not the sharing of an idea, a thesis, a truth claim. It is the immediacy, it is somewhere around the immediacy of an experience. And because there is this romantic anti-intellectualism in as Gadamer represents Dilthey, it is and that's what's so peculiar about the truth of poetry. It can't be turned into a propositional statement. Yeah. It is experienced. When you read a poem, you experience its meaning. You don't formulate its meaning.
Yeah, good. John Beach.
Yeah. I'm just wanted to make sure that what I was trying to say was that when Gadamer is criticizing Dilthey, he's not criticizing Dilthey for not giving the answers that Gadamer would give. Not at all. He's criticizing Dilthey for not solving the problems that he set out to solve himself. Like like this thing about he when Gadamer says Dilthey, this isn't true to really history. That's Gadamer's not defending that. The historian in no way is Gadamer defending that. Um, and the thing is, he's just saying that what Dilthey is doing, trying to do, is impossible. And for Gadamer, his history cannot be separated from consciousness. Like it's just a totally, we're just in a totally different ontological realm here. So he's not, sort of disagreeing. He's just saying that what Dilthey attempted to do was square the circle, and it ain't going to happen. But we're still trying to do it today. We're trying to, with realism, except that, for objectivity and empiricism. So we're just doing it with realism. We're still trying to do that. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that distinction in there.
Yeah, that's good to keep in mind. Greg Lynch.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that I think that the crux of his criticism of Erlebnis and that concept here, it's not that Gadamer saying no, there's no such thing as these lived experiences, or no, not even that no, we can't share them. Those don't play a role in like what happens in art. I think that the crux of his problem is Dilthey's idea that we can take Erlebnis as like kind of the starting point for a theory of meaning in general. That what meaning is the sort of thing we find, and it's kind of like condensed and most basic form in Erlebnis. And then the meanings of artworks are going to be kind of like bigger versions of that, and maybe even the meanings of historical events are going to be even bigger versions of that. Whereas I think Gadamer would want to say, no, meaning is in fact this other kind of thing. And that's what comes first. And insofar as Erlebnisse are meaningful, they're actually drawing categories from this other thing that's more basic than them. So it's kind of like Dilthey's mistake is that he confused something that's step two for being step one. He took as foundational something that's not foundational, and that kind of threw the rest of what he was doing off kilter. Does that sound correct as like what he sees the basic mistake here is amounting to?
Would that be equivalent to taking the part before the whole in a way?
Maybe. So I think I'd be okay. Although I would want to say that it's not simply that our Erlebnisse are just parts of a greater whole. I think that the way things are connected in Erlebnisse is I think different from the kind of connection that Gadamer sees meaningfulness in general. It's maybe like a special case of it. Maybe that'd be the way to put it.
I guess my answer to your question, Greg, is that that's one of the problems. I think he sees multiple problems with their Leibniz. Antoine's talked about some. That would be a kind of problem of a kind of foundationalism. We need to find some sort of core experience that seems to have a certain sort of um, certainty to it, right? This sort of internal certainty, internal significance that then can be used as a kind of starting point for a kind of critical foundation for the human sciences. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right that that's one of his concerns. I don't know if I'd say that's the core concern. Everything follows from it. As much as I'd say there are multiple concerns. But yeah, I don't think he wants to deny we have these experiences. Yeah. I was interested because it was brought up, I forgot who brought it up, the bottom of 81 where he talks about music. Gadamer has the line, excuse me, he's very praiseworthy of Dilthey on music. But then he says, to Dilthey, he says, one could hardly say more. But he says, meaning elements of a different kind, like those that articulate the sense of linguistic expressions, those cannot be found in pure instrumental music. right? Something different is going on there. We can't use music as the model because something different is going on there when we're talking about linguistic meaning. And then he says, all interpretations that assert a univocal content of expression for such a music proceed more or less arbitrarily. So we take a piece and we say, this is about, you know, whatever it might be, the hope and anxiety of Napoleon, right? Something like this. That he says that's just going to be a shot in the dark, trying to sort of nail it down linguistically. Because that's what I take that to mean.
Great. I wanted to ask a question on page 84 that's kind of going back to what we were talking about right before that turn to music, but it's interconnected in the sense that on page 84, we have this kind of the just starting at the very top, peculiar science, which makes the highly peculiar presumption of an ethos that binds us to each other only on the basis of presupposition, blah, blah, blah. Just that there's this practical philosophy that seems to be constantly in tension with modern science. And it goes to the next paragraph. This is the point at which radical conflict between the modern concept of science and its founding in method and objectivity. That there's this tension between practical philosophy that seems to be preserving the kind of ambivalence or the tensions or the conflicts of lived experience that involves both the subjective individualism but the attempts to create community through dialogue. That practical philosophy contains that, whereas modern science kind of has like the authoritarian answer that it doesn't allow for dialogue. It's like a monologue. Oh, that's all.
Yeah, what do people think about that? It's Gadamer is talking about the limitations of the sciences.
Right. Like, are they inexact
Right.
sciences or are they just not sciences in the sense of modern science?
Especially when it comes to practical research. John Arthos.
Yeah, yeah. So this is where I side completely with Gadamer against Dilthey, because to me, and this is, when John used that word preordained, to me, the problem for Dilthey is preordained when he tries to establish a science. To me, it's always felt like he's trying to establish the social sciences in place of the humanities. And so what I'd like to ask is, to me, it seems like Gadamer is saying, um, it's a fool's errand to try to this dream that we're going to be able to, by becoming researchers who are going to be, go back into history and sort of establish these categories of a worldview and so forth, that somehow then we've got life, we've got history down. That's sort of the dream, the sort of the Enlightenment dream of some kind of objectively fixed categorical system that Gadamer is so is so much against. And the fact that Dilthey sort of maintained that sort of dream till the very end is really problematic, and it preordains his failure. But here's my question about that. That puts a burden on Heidegger and Gadamer because, okay, so history is this, the work of historians is this sort of second order activity. It's awfully good that we have social sciences, right? That we have people going back into the archives and determining what actually happened and seeing if there's any causal relationships. And that's really, really helpful to us. But what I've wondered is Heidegger doing something very, sort of radically different by saying that we are historical beings, which is that instead of either trying to relive someone else's experiences or determine what the truth of history is, we, all of us together, through the generations, to the last syllable of recorded time, are living and communicating with each other in dialogue. We are a conversation. Um, and 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 that's what a hermeneutically inflected sensibility is all about being in dialogue with others. It's not the archival work of the historian.
Unless the historical methods, right, transition into how to have a dialogue, right? Because right, I think ethnography, anthropology, history, they all struggle with this. How do you maintain a humane disposition toward your subjects, your research subjects, right? And so there's these groups that are trying to promote, well, have a dialogue with your research subjects rather than this kind of positionality.
Don Marshall.
I agree with John Arthos, and of course, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Gadamerian, so let's just begin there. But I was struck on page 75, he uses the phrase, which was very startling to me, yeah, and says something about Dilthey's project of wanting to achieve scientificity, scientific status for the human sciences. Okay, he talks about the pathos of empirical sciences. Okay, he talks about later about Dilthey wanting to live in the full light of objectivity. You know, I mean, I agree. There's something, and Gadamer talks about this. There's something sort of aggressively domineering about the way in which science is given an exclusive patent on the truth. This is really a terrible idea for many reasons. But at the same time, I think, and I can't do this, but we need to kind of weigh, why is it that the sciences are so enormously attractive, and struggling against them by saying, well, there's this practical philosophy and there's solidarity and, blah, blah, and there's dialogue and the dialogue over the ages. For a lot of people, this just cuts no mustard. And I think they're wrong, but I think one has to weigh. I mean, he's constantly saying Dilthey is trying to establish a science. He's influenced by John Mill's inductivity. He's interested in the empirical sciences. He wants to be able to have a truth that can stand up to the rigor and objectivity of science. And you think, this is not a crazy ambition. It's just unfortunately something which is impossible. It can't be done. Okay. So, yeah.
I wonder if we're treating science too strongly. I mean, I think part of the idea is just there's a logic to it. So if we're talking about the humanities, we could say, well, there's a logic to the ways in which literature has moved across the 20th century. So looking back now, we can sort of see why we shouldn't be surprised that this happened at this time, or same with art. And maybe that's all Dilthey is looking for, something where you can sort of map out the logic. So we can say it doesn't make sense to do this kind of novel any longer, except ironically, or as a kind of throwback, or as a kind of reactionary gesture. Um,
If I could just add one point,
yeah,
and that is that he speaks about Dilthey not really simply trying to establish the foundations, scientific foundations of the human sciences. Ultimately, he wanted a way to have the same grounding and foundation for both natural sciences
yeah,
and human sciences. So he was really aiming at both of them, not just at, yeah.
yeah, and that's a grand romantic gesture, right? That feels like Schelling or one of these people who are going to say, in his case, it's life, right? Everything is an expression of life, whether it's nature or culture. But yeah, a grand unified theory was hopefully, when that's sort of a understandable but tragic ambition is what you're saying, right? We all would like to have great order to everything, but we can't. Eric?
I wanted to build off of this too, to add on page 85, there's this paragraph that it's the first full paragraph break. It cannot be denied that Dilthey really held on to such a claim. This is the part where it goes beyond what we were just saying, that he wants to find a foundation that is supportive of both the human sciences and the natural sciences. Here, it's Gadamer says it. He wanted to regulate practice through the human sciences.
Sure.
That it's not merely about finding the foundation. It like is Gadamer kind of calling Dilthey a fascist here? Like just
It does. I feel like I might defend Dilthey too. Maybe Antonio would as well.
but then
What
but
is
then
wrong with, so say we have sociological studies that show that certain sort of social organizations lead to greater democratic practices and more open dialogue and communication among its citizens. Should we welcome that and let that inform the ways in which we set up a society without it?
but
Doesn't
this
become
is where
fascist
but
automatically.
if we keep going in the paragraph, this is what it's really about. So toward that is it possible for any science to cultivate the good?
Yeah.
And as practical philosophy can claim, they're focused on the good. But then we keep going. Socrates showed us once and for all that objectivity of science releases its results from any random use and is not itself in a position to assume responsibility for its use in the service of the good. And so I'm understanding that as science is dislodged from its communal good, right? The common good.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why when we have politicians, right? I remember Trump versus Biden with regard to COVID. Biden kind of sold himself as the advocate of science, right? Like I'm going to use science as part of my administrative effort, but then of course doesn't actually follow through on that sort of thing. But just that the question of the good cannot be answered by scientific methods.
Yeah, but we'll get into that. I've got things I want to say about that. But Antoine, you've been waiting. Go ahead, Antoine.
Well, it's puzzling over the same kind of passages, and I was so it looks like Dilthey is criticized for not making use of the Aristotelian tradition of practical philosophy
Right.
on 84. And I guess that comes back. I mean, that's still discussed on 85 as well. Why? I mean, I'm having a hard time understanding why Gadamer thinks it's kind of necessary that Dilthey does that. He says that with the modern concept of science, he says it's not without reason that the tradition of practical philosophy has met it with its demise in the age of science. And I'm not sure I understand why. It seems reasonable to me to say that there's the possibility to operate that distinction between the natural sciences and the moral, political / human sciences, and therefore to recover practical philosophy in the latter. That's exactly what Gadamer does. So I'm a bit puzzled about why he seems to think that practical philosophy would kind of die with the rise of the modern concept of science, and why was it kind of why was that not an option for Dilthey, I suppose is my question. Precisely as Dilthey does think that there is a scission between the natural sciences and the humanities and social sciences. I also, just a footnote, the moral political sciences, I asked, and David said that it's moralisch-politischen Wissenschaften. It's interesting, I was thinking maybe it would have been Geisteswissenschaften because as you know, the German Geisteswissenschaften come as a translation of John Stuart Mill's Moral Sciences. So I thought maybe that was related, but I don't know. Those are my set of puzzles.
That always gets translated in this as human sciences. So whenever you see human sciences, that's Geisteswissenschaften.
Okay.
Yeah. All right, John Beach.
Yeah, this is, I think we're really getting deep, digging down deep here. Um, the Aristotle clearly uh, conceptually established the distinction between nature and the world of, first philosophy, um, and what, with his concept of physis, and which is not having to do with the the doctrine of the four causes, but it was just used to show that it was not what Plato was saying. And I think that Gadamer thinks that that is something we've lost. And he goes back to to Dilthey in a way Dilthey did, and separate, did recognize their separation. And but there's somewhere here where he makes a statement about nature. I can't find it, but the difference between the world of nature and the world of humanity, and historicity and so on, which is something that we, we haven't been able to redefine. We haven't been able to step away from, and so we're still fighting. In a way, we're still fighting uh, Dilthey's battle, even though Heidegger, certainly Gadamer, did find a way around it, because otherwise, like even the social scientists today, I have a good friend who wrote his thesis on Dilthey. He's a sociologist. He's the head of this Canadian Institute for the Family for many years, and like they cannot find another philosopher to replace Dilthey, and they cannot overcome the relativism that is there. And so, anyway, there's a few ideas jumbled in, thrown in together that I'm just throwing out. I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. John Arthos.
Yeah. And partly this does go back, I think, to his reference to Aristotle on page 80. So to me, it's helpful to distinguish first order and second order knowledge. So in his debate with Ricoeur, Gadamer says at some point, of course, we need all types of knowledge. And what he was saying there is, the social sciences, and the sciences, and mathematics, and all of these things are helping us enormously, right? All of this all of this advance and progress in science, and in medicine, and all these things are of enormous help. But what he's against is this kind of this sort of this systems building, this lust after and Merleau-Ponty even is using the word algorithmic knowledge, right? Sort of back in the 50s and 60s, right? This idea that somehow we can sort of create a formula that will give us the answer. And so this is why Gadamer has to always go back to Aristotle and phronesis, right? That prudential knowledge is going to have to govern, the decision about what's the right thing to do in each given situation. We cannot plug that into a computer algorithm, right, for an answer. And so he says here on page 80, and likewise, being trapped in subjectivity, the Diltheyan trap, right, is also not going to help us. So he says at the bottom of the last sentence in that first major paragraph, rather, what is decisive for Aristotle is the individual fitting into the stability of the moral and political order. And so That's going to be how that is accomplished through these prudential virtues, right? These ethical virtues of judgment and dialogic deliberation and so forth, which cannot rely exclusively on some sort of criteriology or something like that.
Yeah, good. That clears up the contrast. Greg Lynch.
Yeah, I think this is consonant with what John just said. I wanted to take a stab at answering Antoine's question. I'm not sure if this is correct or not, but my first thought was that what Gadamer sees as distinctive about Aristotelian practical philosophy here is that it kind of unapologetically starts out from somewhere, right? Like, we're Greeks. We value these things. How do we know that these character traits are virtuous? Well, ask any other, upstanding member of Greek society, and they'll tell you that this is right. And okay, now let's kind of philosophize from this standpoint where in modernity and once we have the ideal of science taken on board, that way of thinking just won't cut it any longer because the question's going to immediately come up. Well, how do we know that the values that our society has are the right ones? How do we ground those? How do we justify those? So once we take up the scientific kind of standard, now there becomes this need to kind of get back behind our own values and our own existing moral and political order to ground it and justify it in some way, rather than just philosophizing from out of it, which is what I think Gadamer's saying that Aristotle does here. And that's what I took the problem to. Once that standard is on the books, that you can't occupy a perspective or a framework without having first theoretically justified that framework. That Aristotle's way of doing practical philosophy just isn't going to be an option for you any longer. Does that make sense?
I
I don't
would
know if
just
that's
say
right or not. That was just
Gadamer would say it is an option.
no, exactly. But
Linguisticality.
it's not an option insofar as you adopt the ideal of modern science.
Precisely.
Yeah, so
Precisely.
Gadamer's going to say, well, so much the worse for that ideal.
Exactly.
But Dilthey, of course, is still very much wedded to that ideal.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah.
That was.
Yeah, that helps. Don Marshall. You may need to unmute yourself, Don.
All right, there we go. Yeah, so on page 85, he mentions this, Dilthey wants the human sciences to be able to regulate society. That he wants them to make a contribution to the intellectual life of Europe. Okay. And that contribution has to be guiding. And Gadamer then raises the example of Socrates and says he shows that expertise just doesn't work. So on 85, he says objective scientific knowledge can't say what is the right way of life for an individual, a society, a nation, or humanity to lead. So, okay, so that's on that side. Scientific knowledge can't do that. But then he will say on page 86, one can object that modern science simply precludes a renewal of practical philosophy. Why? Well, two reasons. One is the one that was just being mentioned here. We cannot universalize Aristotle's defense of a slave society. We can't do that. We live in a world where there are various kinds of perspectives and points of view and notions. So we need to have some founding, but we can't have a founding that's circular. We do this because we do it. This is right because that's what we do. What we do is right. What is right is what we do. And so he will say, can such a science lead beyond the relativity of all forms of ethos? So there's no going back from the dawn of consciousness and the demand for grounding that comes with modern science. There's just no going back from it. But we don't see. So I think the suggestion with Gadamer is that's the wrong question. You're asking the wrong question, and so all of your answers are unsatisfactory. Okay. And he wants to put a different answer in place. Yeah.
Don, can you say a bit more about how Gadamer solves the problem of cultural relativism?
Huh.
If we do not have absolute grounds, um, how does a community or a society then determine what is the right thing to do?
Yeah. What a wonderful question. Oh dear. I can see I shouldn't have spoken, but I do think the answer lies back there in the notion of coming to an understanding. You can come to an understanding with other people, even when they have very different points of view. In fact, it's essential that you come to an understanding with people who have different points of view. That's kind of his sense of it, I think. Now, working that out took him how many pages in Truth and Method and other things. But it isn't that solidarity is the wrong answer. It's just that solidarity cannot be presupposed and presumed. Okay. So we need to examine these things. That's the best I can do on the spot. And I will now go away and repent for what I've said. But
No, don't talk about that. I want to say something about this on 85 because I was really unsympathetic with Gadamer's criticism here. And I guess what struck me is that I think it's a very modern Enlightenment idea that facts and values are two separate worlds. You sort of get that in Hume. Um, and an Aristotelian idea that we can, read purpose off of nature, right? That biology can tell us purposes and we can get values straight from that. So when he says about science, the more objective it becomes, it does not know on the basis of that knowledge whether it is right for individuals to lead their own way of life. It feels like to me that Gadamer is reverting to a very strict distinction between sort of facts and values, when it seems to me that science actually does that fairly well, helps us see how to better organize society. Even softer sciences like education theory, we have theories about different practices of education that allow us to be more successful in structuring our schools. And so it seems to actually be built into that the scientific advances help us to lead our society in ways that are better. And so then I didn't understand when Gadamer said about Dilthey that he thought science will enable a transition from the facts of reality to the ought, the purpose, the ideal. That seemed to be exactly right. That Dilthey is the one breaking down that fact value distinction. Um, in the same way, Aristotle might say the same thing. The facts of reality will tell us purposes and ideals. So I was a bit confused about this objection. I also think there's a common response, which is that science is not value neutral. I think that's something we'd all agree with. But some of the values of science are collaboration, um, making decisions based on evidence, revising one's views in the light of evidence provided by others. Um, those seem to be scientific values that are also usable for shaping a society where we're going to make decisions on a society based on evidence. We're going to make decisions in society collaboratively. We're going to make decisions of society in ways that take seriously a wide variety of experiences and observations. So I was sort of, I felt I wasn't quite with Gadamer on this quick criticism of science over here telling us facts, but it doesn't tell us how we should use those facts. But I think I'm in the minority in this group today. So John Veach, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Well, this may shock you, but we do not, we have Aristotle completely wrong. Nowhere in Aristotle's text does he say that we can base values of practical philosophy on science or on nature. Nowhere does he say that. That's what Heidegger has messed us up on that. He says that physis was a word for being, was not, never was for Aristotle. Aristotle distinguished it, which is why his criticism of Plato it goes central. And another thing, our sort of Enlightenment 17th century view of Aristotle is completely wrong as well. So we're living in this illusion about what Aristotle actually said and about this universal teleology and which is bullshit. It's not there. It's not in the text. So until we learn from Gadamer how to get Aristotle right, none of Gadamer's not going to make a lot of sense. Like we'll still be wandering around in the wilderness with Dilthey as we are today.
Okay.
So what I had some other thoughts, but this is something that Gadamer held back, but his student Wieland published stuff on Gadamer's physics that Gadamer never did because it would have destroyed his career. But it's gone very well, and German's gone through 3 editions. It's been translated into Italian, and I'm going to try to get it translated into English. But Aristotle said no, like physis is not the problem with Plato in the Timaeus was that he had a maker involved in the creation, and so the 4 causes, the techne applied to Plato does not apply at all to Aristotle's concept of physis. We've got that fundamentally wrong. Heidegger knew that. Heidegger figured that out in his essay published in the 50s on Aristotle's concept of physis. Heidegger did get that right, but his earlier stuff about physis being an early Greek concept of being, no justification, no evidence whatsoever. So I'm just going to throw that out.
Thanks, John.
Okay.
Greg Lynch.
Yeah, David, I was just going to say in response to your kind of being puzzled about this paragraph. I don't think Gadamer here is denying that science that we can use science, or that science itself can realize how it can be put to use to help us more efficiently or directly achieve our society's goals, and that it has a practical upshot in that sense. I think the question is about, well, which goals are we supposed to adopt in the first place? And I think that's what he's denying, that science, at least science in the modern sense of science that he's working with here, can do. So you're exactly right that education theory and psychology and sociology can give us lots of conditionals that say, okay, if you want to accomplish X, Y is going to be the best way to do that. But the question, well, should we want X in the first place, seems like precisely the sort of thing that science can't do for us. Although I think a lot of modern philosophers thought that some form of Wissenschaft could do that. Does that?
Yeah, I guess I see.
Would you disagree with that point, David, or?
I think that there are places where the sort of fact value breaks down. I mean, I think like Anscombe talks about the term dangerous, which is normative at the same time as it's descriptive, and science often tells us lots of things about how vaccines are not dangerous, diseases are or not dangerous. And to say something is dangerous, or this is dangerous to the function of our society, we can't simply say yes, but maybe we're not choosing maybe we want to choose the dangerous life or something like that. That seems to go against sort of the very idea. So I think there are certain concepts that are not simply descriptive versus normative.
Oh, I think that's right, but I think the ideal of modern science is to precisely not use those kinds of concepts, right? Like a thoroughly going, science that's achieving the modern ideal is not going to use the word dangerous. It's going to say that, X phenomenon, leads with such and such a mathematical probability towards Y outcome. And describing that outcome as a bad one or a dangerous one is precisely to step out of your role as a scientist in a way.
Yeah, I guess I see science as partially shaped by the concerns of a society and reflecting those and being funded as a response to those. And so not so value neutral from the start. And so also then the results of science being well designed to contribute to the well-being of society in ways that doesn't seem like so foreign to it. But maybe this is a different debate for another day.
Yeah,
But
maybe.
I know
Yeah.
exactly what you're saying. I mean, I remember during COVID, Bill Barr was at a college near me saying it doesn't matter what science says. We are in charge of our values, not science. So science may say this is what will help with COVID, but still values are up to us, and we get to decide whether we want to follow the science at this moment or whether we want to follow other beliefs at this moment. And so, yeah, there's still the further question that science doesn't answer. Should we follow science? I guess that's part of what you're saying, right?
Right. Or yeah, is what do we do with this conditional science is given us? Science says, hey, look, if you interact with other people right now, 10% more people are going to die. We've got to, okay, is that worth it? Which of these do we value more? And that's where the biologists and the medical doctors can't help us any longer.
Right. Yeah. Okay. John Arthos.
So yeah, so David, I will support you. The problem rhetorically is when you sort of establish this harsh binary between science and everything else. And Gadamer was, and he acknowledged this later on, right? And Joel Weinsheimer has good on this as well, that you can't paint with too broad brush when you're talking, because as you say, there's plenty. I mean, if you think about epidemiology and the practices that are, and the habits and the ethos of good scientific work, there's plenty of phronesis in there. I think that, so you have to put Gadamer in his historical moment, right? In the 50s and 60s, what he had this enormous polemical task, right? To overcome the presumptions of science that we've been talking about, right? But it does feel to me like when you read in The Reason, the Age of Science and so forth, he uses the word science with a capital S. Of course, it's in English, it has a capital S. In German, you wouldn't see that. But it really means this sort of science with a capital S. It's too broad brush often. And the sad thing about that to me is that has made it very difficult for scientists to read Gadamer without prejudice, right? Because he sort of too often sort of uses science with a capital S as sort of as the enemy to be defeated, and that sort of shuts down conversation with too many scientists. So I would have liked him to moderate that a little bit, but again, I wasn't there then when he was trying to fight this battle.
So let me switch back to one of the first things you asked, John, about where do Dilthey and Gadamer come together? Because what you just say maybe reminded me of their Leibniz cult in the 20s was a response to the crisis of the First World War and a hyper rationalization and the thought that we need something to check science because science is just learning how to kill us more and more efficiently, right? And often that the Leibniz philosophy was contrasted with the rationalism that they saw going on with the rise of science. And that shaped Dilthey, of course. He's one of the main spokespeople for it, but also shaped a young Gadamer who sort of bought into that movement at that time. So maybe we can talk about ways in which Dilthey and Gadamer both see something in the human sciences that helps us resist a scientific way of thinking. For example, I'm trying to think of ways in which we could see Gadamer and Dilthey together in what he says in this text is Gadamer himself between romanticism and positivism, for example.
Can I just ask?
Yeah.
So in the very last paragraph,
Mhm.
and this was a puzzle. I mean, again, so he's talking about the experience, the bloody experience of World War I for a whole generation. Okay,
Right.
and the shaking up of liberal cultural consciousness. So
Yeah.
there's this kind of disruption going on. He says it was it was a new immediacy that we sought then,
Hmm.
and I don't know what that means. What does this mean? A new immediacy? What does he say? You know,
Don, what page is that on again?
this is on page
89.
89. Okay, it says in the middle of the paragraph, it says it was a new immediacy that we sought then, which had to break through the hard crust of the scientific culture of the 19th century.
I think
We
he's
think
talking about the
we think
romantic.
we're dominated by science. The 19th century,
Yeah,
makes us look like pikers,
especially at
But
that
what is
period.
this new immediacy? I didn't. He's thinking of something. I just have no idea what.
I thought he's talking about a Leibniz, right? These sort
Ah,
of
okay.
moments of sort of deep personal life affirming significance where we think there's all this terror around us, but then we see a flower and realize, yes, but there's this too, right? Or with these sort of moments of sort of deep significance where we feel like I'm still alive, things are still meaning in the world. It's not just death and destruction and some sort of march of reason. We
The
have this as
term
well, and we can make art. John Arthos.
the term immediacy is a term of equivocation in Gadamer. Most of the time, um, it's anathema to him when he's criticizing Dilthey, for instance, this idea of the immediacy of experience. But here he's using it in a positive sense, I think, right? Um, uh, you know, he, he's always fighting with his father, right? Um, the scientism or the science, his father wanted him to be a scientist like him or whatever. Um, and and so the immediacy that he of his generation, he wrote this about his own generation, right? They wanted to break out of this sort of this systems less the systems desire of the scientific community to establish these paradigms of knowledge and everything, which was encrusted, right? He uses the word encrusted here, and so I think it's about that.
I would just throw in just real quick. For Gadamer, science is trial and error. He's got no problem with it as long as it stays in its proper area of application. You know, works.
John, Beach, what's an example where science is overreaching, where it's not staying within its limit?
Well, when it tries to say that it is the sole arbiter of what is true, that's where it's presumptuousness and arrogance knows all bounds. It's not that we have anything against science, as long as it just does science. But when it tries to get into the, you know, what is real, being and truth,
Mm.
like, whoa, not that's not what it's meant to be. And I mean, Aristotle knew that. So did Socrates. Socrates knew that. Plato did too. And that's why Socrates said, "Well, I don't get anything from this 200-year tradition. So I'm going to look in the mirror of the logoi, which is exactly what Gadamer does in Truth and Method. That's Gadamer's answer. Linguisticality. That's the ontology. That's the way, and that's what Aristotle did when he said all the Greeks know this. Yeah, because the only thing we will ever know is what is embedded in our culture, in our language, in our historicity. We'll never get outside of that. We can't get to the absolute. Forget it. This is why dialectic is the way to get to philosophical truth, and it has nothing to do with experience whatsoever or trial and error. Okay, there's my little
Good.
diatribe.
Don Marshall.
I, I, I'm inclined to say, let me suggest this, and then maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not. But it isn't so much that science overreaches by taking on an area of investigation that it shouldn't. Okay, it overreaches when it presents as firm truths what it discovers. That is, when it does not acknowledge the necessarily revisable nature of all scientific investigations and the questionability of all scientific results. And that produces very bad consequences. And we've seen this in the debates over things like masking, where, today, don't wear a mask. It's not necessary. COVID won't bother you. And then a month later, oh, you should wear a mask, everybody. And then everybody says, well, these people don't know what they're talking about. It's not that they don't know what they're talking about. It's that they should never have spoken obiter dicta. They shouldn't have ever spoken as though what they said was the final last word. And you see this in the teaching of science. Science is taught as a collection of facts. And you have to submit to these facts. It is not taught as an inquiry into the natural world and its structures, and where things are revisable and everything is up. It has to be is potentially questioned. So I think it is this self-representation, especially when it sets into the public sphere and needs to give a pronouncement on some subject. And then scientists should run for cover. The same way economists ought to run for cover when people say, what do you think inflation is going to be next year? They say, I refuse to discuss this question. I have no crystal ball, but they don't. They go ahead and answer, fools that they are. So that's where science is really dangerous, and dangerous to its own nature.
Okay, good. Eric.
I wanted to get at a specific example of this kind of tension between science and lived experience on page 82. After the paragraph, one can wonder how a science is at all possible on the basis of such inner facts. Go to the middle of that paragraph, talking about Newton and Goethe on color. And here the sentence starts, both can be compatible in the end as long as they mean something different. When we see something that is colored, we can know all the same that we are affected by real light waves. To me, this is the same example that he uses in Truth and Method, where he says, there's no such thing as a beautiful sunset. We all know that there's only beautiful earth spins, but yet we still enjoy sunrises and sunsets because the discourse of science or the ideology of cosmology or whatever doesn't get all the way to our lived experience. We still experience sunsets and sunrises, even though we know scientifically that there's no such thing as a sunset. And so to me, it's the same thing here, where the lived experience of color is I see blue, but the scientific explanation for seeing blue is you're actually seeing everything but blue.
Right. Yeah. So I'm
So I guess I don't experience that as having the answer, right? Because it didn't win, right? Yeah, we do have the answer. The Earth rotates around the sun, but yet that scientific knowledge did not win relative to the lived experience of beautiful sunsets or something like that.
right. Yeah, sure.
So to me, that makes the conversation a higher order conversation. It's not about like specific scientists or something like that, right? It's when the new atheists like Neil deGrasse Tyson become authoritarian with regard to their Islamophobia, their sexism, all this stuff that actually has nothing to do with the specific scientific inquiries that they're talking about. Like there's this, like, it goes back to that question of to what degree can the social sciences help manage lived experience?
Right. So, I mean, there's always the problem of misplaced expertise, whether you're scientists or anything else. But I think Gadamer thinks there are real limits to what science can ever do. And he thinks that there is a rationality to science, even understood broadly as looking for a logic of something, that if we think that is the gold standard of rationality, we'll never be able to take seriously wisdom, practical reason that we need in order to live successfully. And so that's, I think, two concerns that aren't just about misplaced expertise, that are about a culture of science blocking off things that are really essential to what it means to be human. If that, I mean, I think that that's part of the story as well. Yeah, Greg Lynch.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, David. I mean, Gadamer says in Truth and Method somewhere or other that it's like, look, my goal was never to change what scientists do. It's to change our to change their self-conception, right? Their account of what they're doing when they do what they're accomplishing when they do the things they do. I've always, so John McDowell in Mind and World at one point says something like, look, the big mistake of modernity was that we invented this new way of making things intelligible when we came up with modern science. And the mistake was to think that this new way of making things intelligible is not a new way on top of the other ones, but that no, now we've seen through the other ways of making things intelligible, and now we've seen what they really are. Right. So now we see that the sun doesn't really set, really, it's just the earth moving. And so I don't know, Eric, if it's even as much like, well, look, science didn't win, the other side won. It's that no, these were never actually in competition with one another in the first place. And that was the mistaken thought, was that there's just one question here. And since science has answered the question, well, that's what it is. No, that science is asking one kind of question, but there's this other kind of question that remains legitimate, and that's Gadamer's worry, is that we've ceased to recognize the legitimacy of all of those non-scientific questions, and that's the root of the problem here. When we recognize that, we say, yeah, of course, scientifically speaking, the Earth is rotating, the sun's not moving, but that's not what we're talking about when we say that there's a sunset. We're just doing a different sort of thing.
Yeah, good. I have a question and maybe it's just sort of a flip way of putting it, but I wonder, the title is The Problem of Dilthey Between Romanticism and Positivism. And I wonder if the real title is The Problem of Dilthey, Positivism. Because I just don't know what he's saying positive at all about positivism, that part of Dilthey. And I sort of feel like he's fine with Dilthey's romanticism unless it becomes foundational. That is, unless it becomes infected by positivism. It's almost like the problem with Dilthey's romanticism is the positivistic spirit. And then there's nothing good about positivism. So is there any sense, am I completely misreading that? Are there things about positivism that Gadamer thinks are good and Dilthey just gets it wrong? Or is that's really the problem here? Yeah, John Beach.
For clarification, on page 76, he says a historical positivism of British empiricism.
Right.
Is there non ahistorical positivisms?
No, I think
Is
that
it
belongs to the
positivism
character of
intrinsically?
positivism is that science will tell us everything we need to know. And it sort of progresses, and there's other sorts of views. Yeah, John Beach.
Yeah, thanks, David. I just in response to your question, um, I think that he's saying that um, there are many wonderful truths and wonderful things in romanticism and so on, but it's not. It was really a reaction to the Enlightenment, not really. Uh, uh, I mean, it can't stand up to the Enlightenment. I mean, that's Horkheimer or Adorno, say that Gadamer agrees with their position. Like the thing is that what like the hermeneutics is the only thing that can stop the bulldozer of positivism and scientism from leading us to commit suicide, which we're getting very close to the end, which I've said before. It's not going to happen with romanticism or with art, really. So it's just that they haven't solved the problem, and I think that Gadamer has, and I think that we're a victim. See, all of contemporary Aristotelianism, the university are full of people that say that the really brilliant scholars say that Aristotle is completely consistent, but he's all wrong. See, this is because they're interpreting Aristotle incorrectly. So this is where Gadamer comes along, and Heidegger started it and says, okay, let's break ourselves free from this. That helps science keep us in its grasp. To say that okay, the alternative was false. Aristotle was false, and Greek metaphysics was dismissed. That's our problem, and Gadamer knows that, and that's why he keeps referring to it. It's all throughout Truth and Method too. In the end, that's where he goes back to. Yeah. That's what philosophy. You want to know what philosophy is? You've got to go to the Greeks because it's still just as true today as it was then.
Yeah, that is.
Forget fucking slaves. Whatever. We have our problems.
Go back to the classicist at heart.
Non sequitur.
That's fine. No, that's exactly what I was asking. Any other thoughts about the title? How about we have 10 minutes left. Are there other things that were brought up in here that we haven't touched on that you were interested or curious about that you think deserve an airing or a discussion? A quote that struck you or inspired you? Greg Lynch, was that your hand up?
It was, yeah.
Okay.
Mine is kind of it's not terribly essential to the point he's making in the paper, so I'll defer to if somebody else has.
You can go for it, Greg. We'll have...
So my question, on 78 into 79, he's talking about Brentano. Mm-hmm. And if I can get this on the right page here. So he says, Brentano took it that there's a reflection that accompanies the mental act. This reflection does not take as its object the act with which it is linked when accompanying it and its directedness to the object. I had always taken it to be the case that, no, that's exactly what Brentano thought, is that the way self-consciousness works is that you have one mental act that takes two objects, right? The act takes the worldly entity, like the tree or whatever that you're looking at as an object, and then also takes itself as an object. And it was Husserl who comes along and says, no, that's not right. There aren't two separate objects here. In fact, the self-consciousness of mental acts is non-objectivating. And so am I just wrong about Brentano here, or is Gadamer wrong about Brentano, or is Gadamer reading Brentano in a unusual way that he kind of doesn't comment on here? I just found that very, very curious.
Reflection does not take as object the act with which it is linked. So my understanding of Dilthey on this is that the self-consciousness is a consciousness of us, which itself can't become reflectively self-aware. So it doesn't take as object the act, but takes as object the subject. That's why it's a self-consciousness. So we are, in all our actions, we're also aware of ourselves. Period. Pretty much in everything we are aware of ourselves. There's a Kant line with the I. I mean, I just read McCreel talks about this. The I accompanies all our actions. The awareness of the I accompanies all our actions. And that So I don't think that means the reflection is taking as its object the act, but just simply the self, the I.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I thought Brentano's view was precisely that the act takes itself as a. I've got no idea what Dilthey thinks about this. I just know that, yeah, my understanding was that was like one of the points on which Husserl breaks with Brentano's on that. But again, it also is more or less completely irrelevant to the overall point Gadamer's trying to make in this essay. So it's I don't want to get too bogged down in it. But I tell all my when I'm teaching Husserl on self-consciousness, I tell all my students this that he disagreed with Brentano, and if that's not true, I don't want to keep saying that. Not that they're paying attention to it anyway, but
I don't know what to tell you. John Beach, is there something else here?
Yeah, I to Greg's point, I can't give you an answer, but I think Gadamer would say, and that the idea of intentionality of Husserl did come from Brentano. And the thing is, Husserl talks about the noetic, the realm of the noetic, and this goes right back to Plato, the eidetic. Gadamer shows how Plato discovered the realm of the eidetic, which is where the eidos comes from, which is the ground of Plato's thought. And so there's a connection between there's a Platonism in Husserl. So there's a neutrality with the noetic. It's like mathematics. Mathematics is in the realm of the noetic. It's not experienced. We don't learn it from observation. We always, if we have a number three, where does it come from? We put it in there. We don't say there are three things here. We already know. See, this is mathematics is this completely intermediate realm. And so I think that might help you sort this out, and which I shan't try to do, but I think that's a clue.
Greg, I just looked it up in the McCreel piece, and McCreel calls it a non-representational self-awareness for Dilthey.
Mhm.
So that'd be Eric.
So I mean, this just goes back to what I brought up at the beginning, which is I want to understand understanding. And on page 78 to 79, this is related, Greg, to what you were just talking about. He's trying to, right, if we go to toward the end of the main paragraph on 78, where even his foundation of psychology that is characterized by quote unquote understanding resulted in a text with this title, which consciously avoids the word understanding because they're supposed to be these facts independent of the problematic of understanding. Obviously, the foundation of facts must be secured unambiguously and remain free from the problematic of understanding. And so that's where the shift to Brentano comes in, right? Like this is why he shifts to avoid having to talk about understanding. We want to talk about lived experience or significance or something like that. And that's what I don't get. Why does he need to avoid understanding? I don't know. That's all. Like, what is the problematic of understanding that he's trying to avoid? I just don't get that.
Can it be the sort of Schleiermachian issue of divination?
Yep.
One has to divine the
No, that's what he
meaning.
goes into on the next page.
Yeah. So that's it. I mean, if I understand, don't misunderstand here. He's saying that one way of figuring Dilthey is in a shift from psychology to hermeneutics, and he says that's actually wrong. He was a hermeneutic. He was involved with hermeneutics right from the beginning all the way through, but by the end, he had introduced certain ideas that paved the way for Heideggerian hermeneutics, and Hans Lips and other people whom I don't know at all. Okay. So the final paragraph says, it's astounding how much the legacy of Romanticism Dilthey carried with him. And it is this, on the one hand, science, empiricism, on the other hand, understanding. Erklären versus verstehen. Sort of, the human sciences are the zone of hermeneutics, of understanding and interpretation. But he resisted that. He's torn. Okay. Anyway, so
I think I'm saying something similar as Don. We look earlier on the page, it says Dilthey limits the concept of understanding, page 78, to the alien, the other, be it another person or the sensuous
ah,
experience of language and text. So all understanding is interpersonal. So there is no such thing as understanding of a fact. So even when he wants
ah,
to talk about mental facts, he can't talk about how we understand a mental fact because those aren't the kind of things we can understand. We can only understand
Oh,
other people or other
yeah,
people's creative expressions.
yeah,
That's something we might know or explain or do something else, but understanding is not part of that process of mapping out facts, even if oddly the facts we're talking about are the facts of the human mind. Does that make that? That's how I sort of see it. I think it's the same thing Don was saying about
yeah.
how we
That
separated
both of y'all
understanding from.
helps. Yeah,
I, I don't know if this is the same reading or not. I mean, the way I took it in that immediate context there is just that in the ideas toward a descriptive and analytic psychology piece,
Hmm.
Dilthey wants mental facts to function as facts and like the kind of positivist and empiricist sense of facts are the sorts of things that can serve as the independent evidence for theories. And for them to play that role, they have to be kept free of what's the problematic of understanding or interpretation or whatever. Because once you recognize facts as already involving interpretation,
ah,
the interpretation of which comes from the theory, now facts can no longer simply justify the theory, right? If the facts are already theory laden, they don't serve this kind of straightforward role of being the evidence that supports it. And so I took it that his point here was in that early work, at least, even though he's kind of throwing around some hermeneutic language like understanding, he still has this fundamentally positivistic account of mental facts. um,
Yeah,
yeah,
I
and
think that's right, Eric. And what I and not Eric, I think that's right, Greg. And what that brings us back
yeah. It
to
helps a
again
lot.
is sort of the tension between finding scientific explanations for things and then trying to arrive at understandings that may be broader or different than the scientific explanations provide us. I think it's a good way to wrap up since that's been a central theme of our conversation today. And as John Garner's kids told him, the time is up. I think his kids are right. The time is up for us as well. So I want to thank everyone for coming today and for joining us in this sort of deep dive into Gadamer and Dilthey and this tough text from 1985. We're going to meet again in January, mid-January. I'll figure out exactly what Sunday in January works best and let you know and send you out a list of possible texts to choose from. And we'll do this all again.
Thanks. It was great.
Thanks.
thank you, David.
Bye, everyone.